In the spring of 2021, in a sale barn office in Custer County, Montana, a man named Royce Maurer slid a single sheet of paper across a steel desk to a woman named Della Hartman and told her gently, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, that the kindest thing she could do for her late husband's ranch was sell off 2/3 of the cattle before July and lease out the grass to someone who could carry the note. He was not unkind. He had a degree in range science from a good school, 11 years of consulting behind him, and a clean white pickup parked outside with the county extension logo on the door. And he believed every word he said. The number said that on 750 acres in a drought year, with the reservoirs already low and the forecast already grim, a widow of 28 had no business running a cow-calf operation, and that the responsible thing, the arithmetic thing, was to cut the herd to the bone and wait for better weather. 2 years later, in the fall of 2023, that same woman closed on 2 more pastures, 320 acres of deeded grass adjoining her north fence, paid for in cash, and she did it in a year that broke half the ranchers in that part of the state. This is the story of the span between those 2 numbers, and of a grazing journal kept in a dead woman's hand that the experts never thought to read. Let me tell you about Della first, because the easy version of this story makes her a saint, and she was not a saint. She was a stubborn, quiet woman who had married into a ranch she did not grow up on and had spent 6 years learning ground that was not in her blood. Her husband was Tom Hartman, and Tom died in February of 2021 when the truck he was driving home from a feed run went off the ice on the county road and into the tongue, and there was nothing anyone could have done, and people said that, and it did not help. Tom was 31. They had no children. What they had was 750 acres of mixed grass prairie that Tom's family had run cattle on since 1912, a herd of about 190 mother cows, a note at the bank with 11 years left on it, and a single wide that Tom had always meant to replace with a real house and never did. Della was known on that road for 2 things. She did not talk much, and she could read grass. That second thing nobody knew about her yet in 2021 because she had spent 6 years reading it quietly, while Tom ran the ranch the way his father had run it, and she had never once said out loud that she thought the way they ran it was wrong. When Tom died, the conventional wisdom arrived almost immediately, and it arrived in good faith, which is the part people forget. The neighbors came with casseroles, and then, a respectful number of weeks later, with advice. The advice was unanimous. Sell down. But a drought was coming. The long-range maps were the color of a bruise. The grass was already short coming out of a dry winter, and a young widow with a banknote could not afford to gamble on 190 head when the rain might not come. Lease the grass, take a job in town, wait it out. Every person who said it loved her, or at least wished her well, and every person who said it was repeating the only arithmetic they knew. Royce Maurer was the one who put the arithmetic on paper. He came out in April, walked the home pasture in boots that had never seen real mud, and ran his numbers on a tablet while the wind came across the flat, the way it always did in that country, steady and without any particular mercy. His numbers were honest. At the stocking rate the Hartmans had always run. On the forage a drought year would produce, those cows would eat the ranch to dirt by August, and Della would be buying hay at panic prices or selling into a flooded market, either of which would put her behind on the note. Cut to 70 head, Royce said. Lease the rest of the grass. He said it kindly. He called her man. The diminutive sounded like courtesy, and it landed like a verdict. And Della folded the paper in half and put it in her coat pocket and did not argue because arguing was not a thing she did. What Royce did not know, what none of them knew, was that on the kitchen table in the single wide there was a wooden box, and in the box there were 11 cloth-bound notebooks, and the notebooks belonged to a woman named Ada Hartman, Tom's grandmother, who had run that same ground from 1948 until her hands gave out in 1991, and who had written down in pencil every single thing the grass did for 43 years. Let me tell you about the journals, because they are the whole story, and the experts never read them. Ada Hartman had not gone to a single day of range school. She had buried 2 children and a husband on that ranch, and she had kept cattle alive through the droughts of 1961 and 1980 and the killing winter of 1978. And she had done it by treating the grass not as a quantity to be measured once and stocked against. Her notebooks were not poetry. They were the opposite of poetry. They were dates and rainfall, and the color of the western wheatgrass in the second week of May, and where the cattle were, and how long they stayed, and how long the ground rested before they came back. She wrote in a small hand that slanted hard to the right, and she dated every entry, and she never wasted a word on weather as feeling, only weather as fact, inches and days, and the depth she found when she pushed a finger into the soil to see how far the wet had gone. She had moved her cows constantly in tight bunches onto small pieces of ground for short stretches, and then she had pulled them off and let that ground rest for 60, 80, sometimes 120 days before they grazed it again. She wrote down what happened when she did. The grass came back thicker. The roots went deeper. The ground held water. It had no business holding. There was an entry from June of 1964 that Della had read so often the page had gone soft at the corner, where Ada had described digging a shovelful out of a pasture she had rested for a full season, and finding the roots going down past the depth of the blade, white and thick, and beside it a shovelful from a piece she had grazed too hard the year before, where the roots stopped a few inches down in pale, dead threads. Same ground, Ada had written. Same rain. The only difference was rest. That was the entire science of it, written by a woman who had never heard the word agronomy in a sentence a child could read. In the dry year of 1980, when the county average forage fell by half, Ada's pastures, she wrote, carried better than the wet year before, because the litter she had built up over years of rest had cooled the soil and kept the moisture from cooking off. She had measured it the only way she had with her own body. She wrote that on a 100-degree afternoon she had knelt on her bare, overgrazed lane, and then on the litter-covered round of a rested pasture 20 feet away, and laid her palm flat on each, and the lane burned her hand, and the rested ground was cool as a cellar floor. And any seed, or root, or worm trying to live in that difference was living in 2 different climates, 20 feet apart. The litter was the blanket was the whole thing. A bare soil in that country could run 30 or 40 degrees hotter than a covered one in the same sun. And at those temperatures, the water did not soak and stay, it sheeted off and steamed away, and the grass that should have drunk it never got the chance. Ada had not read that in a paper. She had felt it through the skin of her hand and written it down so that a granddaughter-in-law she would never meet could read it 40 years later and keep a herd alive. She had a phrase she used, and she used it 11 times across the 11 books, and Della had read it so many times she could see the pencil pressure of it. Rest is the only thing that's free, Ada wrote. Rest is the only thing that's free. The science had a name for what Ada was doing, though Ada never used it. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Management. Intensive rotation. The agronomists were just then, in 2021, beginning to publish papers on it, on the way that short, intense grazing periods followed by long rest, that the perennial grasses rebuild their root reserves, on how the trampled litter became a mulch that dropped soil temperature and slowed evaporation, on how a diverse sward of native species hedged against any single one failing in a dry year. Royce Maurer had read those papers. He could have explained the mechanism to you in clean, confident sentences. What Royce could not do, what the papers could not do, was tell you that on the specific south slope of the specific pasture, above the specific bend in Hartman's Creek, the blue grama held 3 days longer than the textbook said it should, because Ada had written that down in 1973, and Della had read it. The difference between Royce and Della was not intelligence, and it was not even knowledge, in the general sense. It was that Royce knew grass, and Della knew this grass. So Della did not sell down. She kept the 190 cows, and to almost everyone watching that spring, it looked like grief making a bad decision. If you have ever watched someone you cared about ignore good advice and do the thing that looks like it will ruin them, you know the particular ache of that spring. Stay with me, because the ache is the point, and it does not resolve the way you expect. She did not keep the cattle out of stubbornness, though it looked like stubbornness. She kept them because Ada's books told her exactly how to carry them through a dry year. And the method was not the method everyone around her used. Here is what she did, and I am going to walk you through it slowly, because the slowness is where the truth lives. The Hartman Ranch, the way Tom had run it and his father before him, was set up as 4 big pastures. The cattle went into one in spring and grazed it down through summer and moved to the next, the way nearly every outfit in the county did it, and the way Royce's numbers assumed she would. Continuous grazing, the books call it. The cows pick the plants they like best and eat them again and again the moment they try to regrow, and they walk past the plants they don't like until those take over, and the favored grasses never get to rest, and in a dry year, the whole thing collapses because there is no reserve in the roots and no litter on the ground. Della spent the back half of April and all of May building fence, not permanent fence. She bought polywire and step-in posts and a solar energizer, and she cut those 4 big pastures into 31 small paddocks, some of them no more than 10 acres. And she did it mostly alone, walking miles of line with a spool on her hip and the dog trotting behind her. It was cold work in April, the wind never off her, the ground still frost-hard in the mornings, so the step-in posts bent before they sank, and she had to start a hole with a steel bar in her boot heel. Her hands cracked at the knuckles, and she taped them and kept going. She ran the lines off the old permanent fences for power and walked each new paddock before she closed it, reading the ground the way Ada had taught her without ever teaching her, looking at what grew there and how thick, and whether it had been beaten down in years past. And she sketched all 31 of them onto the back pages of a feed store calendar with the dates she meant to graze each one. The neighbors who drove by saw a young widow stringing flimsy wire across good pastures and shook their heads because to them she was carving a working ranch into a toy, into 31 little squares no serious cattleman would bother with, and a few of them said as much at the co-op kindly, the way you talk about someone you've decided to feel sorry for. The dog was a blue heeler named Trip, 4 years old. Tom's dog, really, who had ridden in the truck the night Tom died and come home in the back of the wrecker and refused to leave Della's side since. Trip learned the new system before the cattle did. He learned that every morning meant a move, a new wire dropped, the bunch pushed tight onto a fresh green rectangle, and the gate shut behind them on the ground they were leaving. He worked low and quiet, the way good healers do, and within 2 weeks he knew the route of the moves better than Della did, and on the mornings she stood at the wrong gate, thinking he would already be sitting at the right one, looking back at her. That was the whole secret, and it does not sound like a secret. Put a lot of cattle on a little ground for a short time, then move them and don't come back for a long time. The cattle ate everything in the small paddock, the grass they liked and the grass they didn't, in a day or two, and they trampled what they didn't eat into a mat on the soil, and then they left, and that ground did not see a cow again for as long as Della could manage, 60 days, 90, more. The grass, grazed once hard and then left alone, did the thing Ada had written down 40 years before. It put everything into its roots. It came back. And the trampled litter lay over the soil like a blanket, and the soil under it stayed cool and damp while the bare, overgrazed ground on the neighbors' places baked and cracked and blew. Let me tell you about the neighbor, because his name was Del Brunner, and his story runs alongside Della's the whole way, and it is not a story to laugh at. Del Brunner ran 1,200 acres just east of the Harkman place, and in the spring of 2021, he did exactly what Royce Maurer advised everyone to do, which was the responsible, conventional thing. He looked at the drought maps, and he was afraid. And his fear was reasonable. He had 300 head and a node bigger than Della's and 2 kids in school, and the maps told him a hard summer was coming. Dell's response to the dry year, though, was the response the whole system taught. He kept his cattle spread thin across his big pastures in continuous graze, set stocked, the way his father had and his father before him, and when the grass got short in June, he started feeding hay early to stretch it. And the hay that year, because everyone was short, cost more than Dell had ever paid. He paid $190 a ton for hay that had cost $90 the year before, and he fed it to cattle standing on ground they had already grazed flat, which meant the hay was not adding to his grass. It was replacing grass that was no longer there. By July, he was hauling water in a 1,500-gallon tank on a flatbed to Pastures, where the reservoirs had gone to crack mud, 2 trips a day, an hour each way, fuel and time he counted in money he did not have. He spent money he did not have to keep doing the thing that was using the grass up, and the more grass he used up, the more hay he had to buy, and the more water he had to haul. And the spiral had a direction, and the direction was down. Della saw him on the road. That July, both of them stopped window to window the way ranch neighbors do, and Dell looked 10 years older than he had in spring. "How's your grass holding?" he asked her. And there was no edge in it, just a tired man making talk. She told him it was holding fine, because it was, and she watched something cross his face that was not quite disbelief and not quite hope, and she did not say more, because there was nothing she could say in a truck window that would not have sounded like a sermon. He tipped his cap and drove on to haul another tank of water. Dell was not a fool. Dell was doing what the experts in good faith told a frightened man to do. That is the cruelty of it. The advice was sincere, and the advice was wrong. And it was wrong in a way that only showed up at the time horizon that mattered, which was the second year, not the first. Della's cattle, meanwhile, that first summer, did something that made no sense to anyone driving past on the county road. They got fatter. On 190 head and no hay in a drought, on ground everyone said could not carry 70. The trick was not magic. The trick was that the cattle were always being moved onto grass that had rested, that was at its most nutritious stage, leafy and green and not yet gone to stem, and they were never forced to eat the ranch down to the dirt and then stand on dirt, waiting. They moved every day to a salad bar that had been growing for 2 months. Ada had a line for that, too. "A cow is a harvester, not a lawnmower," she wrote. "Harvest the top. Move on. Let it grow." By August of that first year, when Royce Mauer's paper had said Della would be selling into a panic, she was instead weaning a calf crop that was heavier than the county average, off ground she had not bought a bale of hay to support, and her reservoirs, fed by the slow water her cooled soil was holding and releasing, still had water in them. She did not tell anyone, that is important. She did not call Royce and read him the weaning weights. She loaded the calves and sold them and made the note payment, and folded the receipt into the wooden box with Ada's journals, and the only living thing, she told, was the dog. People in the county noticed her calves looked good, and they decided she had gotten lucky on a piece of ground that held up better than most, and they went back to worrying about the second year, which everyone could feel coming. Then came Cole. Cole Hartman was Tom's nephew, his older brother's boy, and he was 24 years old in the fall of 2021, and he had a degree in agricultural business from the State University, and a head full of the same arithmetic Royce Mauer carried. Cole's father had left the ranch life for a equipment dealership in Billings, and Cole had grown up adjacent to ranching without ever quite doing it. And when Tom died, Cole felt the pull of the family ground and came out to help his widowed aunt. And he came out, if we are being honest, half certain. He loved her. He was also embarrassed by her. Both things were true at once, the way they often are with the young and the educated when they look at someone doing a thing the books say is wrong. Cole's first month on the ranch was a quiet war. He fought mostly inside his own head. He would stand at the fence in the morning watching Della move the bunch onto another little 10-acre rectangle, and he would do the math he had been trained to do. And the math said this was insane, this was labor-intensive, this did not scale, this was a woman making a full-time job out of something that should take an hour a week. He said a version of that to her once, in October, leaning on the gate while Tripp worked the cattle through. "You could lease all this out," he said. "You could take a job. You're working yourself to death to do by hand what one big pasture does for free." Della rolled up the polywire and looked at the ground the cattle had just left, the ground that would not see a cow again until the new year. "The big pasture isn't free," he said. "It just sends the bill later." And she walked to the next gate, and Cole stood there with the sentence sitting wrong in his stomach, because he could not immediately say why it was wrong, and a young man trained in confidence does not like a sentence he cannot refute. Let me tell you what happened over that winter, because the conversion of a skeptic is never a single moment. It is 1,000 small ones. Cole started reading the journals. He did it at first to humor her and then to find the error in them, because he was sure there was an error, and the search for the error is what undid him. He read at the kitchen table at night under the single hanging bulb, the 11 books stacked at his elbow, and he came in skeptical and stayed late, and the staying late was the first crack. He read Ada's entry from the drought of 1980, and then he drove the 40 miles to the county extension office and pulled the historical rainfall records on their microfilm reader, and the numbers matched, month for month, inch for inch, a dead woman's pencil against the federal record. He read her note that the rested pastures carried better in the dry year than the wet year before, and he could not find the flaw, because there was no flaw, because litter does cool soil and rest does build root reserve, and a diverse native sward is more resilient than a monoculture. And all of it was in the agronomy journals Cole had been assigned in college and had read for the exam and had never once connected to a real piece of ground. He tried for a while to argue it on economics, because economics was his ground and he thought he could win there. He sat across from Della one November night with a legal pad and showed her the labor. 31 moves on a cycle, every day 365 days, the hours adding up to a part-time job nobody was paying for, and he had a column of figures proving that her own labor, valued at what a hand would cost, ate every dollar the method saved. Della looked at his legal pad a long time. Then she asked him one question. "What's Del Brunner's labor worth?" she said, "hauling water twice a day to cattle that are losing weight." Cole did not have a column for that. He had not thought to put a number on the conventional path's labor, because the conventional path was the default, and the default was invisible. And that was the night the argument left him, sitting at a kitchen table looking at a legal pad that had suddenly stopped meaning what he wanted it to mean. Ada had connected it. Ada had run the experiment for 43 years with a herd of cattle and a pencil, and her data set was longer and more specific to that exact ground than anything Cole had ever been handed in a lecture hall. By February of 2022, a year after Tom died, Cole stopped fighting it. He did not announce it. He just started getting up earlier than Della and building wire ahead of her, and one cold morning she found he had mapped all 31 paddocks onto a grid and started logging, move dates and grass recovery, the way Ada had in a new notebook in his own hand, and she did not say anything about it, and neither did he, and that was the conversion, complete and unspoken. And then the second year came, and the second year was worse. The drought did not break in 2022. It deepened. The winter had been dry, and the spring was dry. And by May, the long-range maps that had been the color of a bruise the year before were the color of an open wound. And the whole region understood that this was no longer a dry year. It was a dry era. And the men who had bought hay and hauled water to get through the first year discovered there was no bottom under them. Hay went to a price nobody had ever seen. Cull cows flooded the sale barns as ranchers all over 4 counties dumped herds they could no longer feed, and the flood crashed the cull price, so that the very act of selling down, the responsible thing Royce had advised, now lost money on every head, because everyone was doing it at once. This is where the story stops being about grass and starts being about which kind of knowing keeps you alive. Del Brunner went under that summer. Not in a single dramatic moment, but the way these things actually happen, in a series of phone calls and a notice in the mail and a sale he stood at the back of with his cap in his hands. He had spent 2 years buying hay and hauling water to keep a herd grazing the conventional way on ground that conventional grazing had stripped, and the bank had carried him as long as it could, and then it could not. And in August of 2022, the auctioneer Della had heard her whole married life came out to the Brunner place. In the fall, the ground. Del stood by his truck and watched, and Della drove past on the county road and saw him standing there, and did not slow down to gawk, because there is nothing crueler than an audience for a man's worst day. She went home, and she was quiet for a long time. There was no triumph in it for her. The same advice that had nearly taken her ranch had taken his, and the only difference between them was 11 cloth notebooks on a kitchen table. Royce Maurer came back that August. Not to apologize, because he did not yet know he had anything to apologize for. He came because the Extension Service had sent him to do drought assessments across the county, counting how bad the damage was, and his route brought him down the Hartman Road, and he stopped because what he saw from the road did not match anything in his model. He stood at Della's north fence and looked at green. Not lush, not a lie, but green. Real standing forage in the 3rd year of a drought that had turned the rest of the county the color of a paper bag. The line of her fence was a line between two worlds on the neighbor's side, bare cracked ground and Russian thistle. On Della's side, a diverse stand of native grass with litter on the soil and cattle, fat cattle, more cattle than his paper had ever said that ground could hold, grazing a little green rectangle in a tight bunch while the dog lay in the shade of the truck. Royce had a tablet in his hand. He did not look at it. He looked at the fence line for a long time, and then he did the thing that makes him, in the end, not a villain, but a good man. Caught inside a wrong model. He asked a question. "How?" he said. "Not how dare you. Just how?" Della was on the other side of the wire. She did not gloat. She had no speech ready, because she had never imagined this moment and would not have rehearsed it if she had. She told him the truth in the fewest words it would fit into. "My husband's grandmother figured it out," she said. "I just did what she wrote down." And Royce Maurer, range science degree, and 11 years of consulting and a clean white truck, stood at a widow's fence in the worst drought of his career and asked if he could see what she wrote down. That was the recalibration. It was not loud. It was a man's model failing in front of him and a man choosing, to his great credit, to become a student instead of defending the ruins. Let me tell you about the number now, because there is one, and it is the kind of number that lands quietly and then keeps landing. In the fall of 2022, an order buyer named Margaret Voss came up from a finishing operation in Nebraska, working the drought country, because that was where the cattle were being dumped and the deals were to be had. Voss had bought cattle for 30 years. She did not buy on a story, and she did not negotiate twice. She walked pens at sale barns all over the dry counties, looking at thin cattle off burned-up grass. And then someone told her about the Hartman calves, and she drove out to the ranch to look at a calf crop that had been raised in a drought on grass alone. She walked the pens. She ran her hand down a few backs, feeling for the flesh over the ribs, and the spring of the rib itself, the way a buyer reads a calf with her hand and not her eye. She lifted a few heads and looked at the bloom on the hair coat, the slick shine that comes off cattle that have eaten well and never been stressed hungry. She was quiet for a long time, the way people are quiet when a thing in front of them is better than the thing they expected, and she walked the whole crop twice before she said anything. "These off grass," she finally said. "No grain?" It was not really a question, but Della answered it anyway. "No grain," she said. "Just the moves." Voss nodded slowly and looked out across the green paddock behind the pens, the cattle on it grazing in their tight bunch, and then she looked back at the calves, and then she asked Della what she wanted for the whole crop, and Della named a fair price, the going rate for that fall, and Margaret Voss shook her head. "That's not enough," Voss said. "These wean heavier than anything I've seen come off grass this year, and they did it without a bushel of grain. I'll pay more than that." And she named a figure. The figure was for the calf crop, and it was enough after the note payment to leave Della with a number in the bank she read 3 times, standing at the kitchen table with Ada's journals open in front of her. $41,000, clear, in the 3rd year of the worst drought in living memory, on the same 750 acres, a man had stood in a sale barn office and told her could not carry the cattle to do it. $41,000. She sat down at the table. Tripp put his head on her knee. She did not call anyone. She read the number a 4th time, and then she closed the journal and put her hand flat on the cover the way you put your hand on the shoulder of someone who is gone. And that was the whole celebration, a woman and a dog and a dead woman's handwriting in a single wide on a dry plain. What landed in that kitchen was not just the money. It was the proof that the money was not luck. Margaret Voss had not paid a premium for a sad story. She had paid it for weaning weights, which are arithmetic, which do not lie, and the weaning weight said that everything Ada had written and everything Della had done was true and repeatable, and that the whole confident apparatus that had told a grieving young woman to settle down had been wrong, sincerely and completely wrong. Yea, only time horizon that counted. Let me tell you what she did with it, because what a person does, after they are proven right, is the truest thing about them. She did not buy a new truck. She did not replace the single-wide, not that year. In the fall of 2023, when the Brunner ground next to hers finally came up for sale, the 320 acres along her north fence that Dell had lost, she bought it. 2 pastures, deeded grass, paid for in cash from 2 years of calf crops. The drought was supposed to have wiped out. There is a hardness in that. Buying the ground, a broken neighbor, lost, and Della felt it. So here is the thing she did that the arithmetic would never have predicted. She found Del Brunner, who was working at the co-op in town by then, and she offered him the chance to run cattle on his old ground again on shares under her method, with her teaching him the moves. And Del, who was a proud man and had every reason to say no, stood in the co-op parking lot and said yes, with his voice breaking on the single word. Because pride is a luxury and a second chance is not. That is how the method spread. Not through a paper Royce Maurer published, though he did eventually write one, and he credited a rancher and her late husband's grandmother in it, which is its own small miracle in that world. It spread the way real knowledge has always spread in cattle country, over a fence, in a truck, one skeptic at a time. By 2024, there were 6 outfits in that part of Custer County running some version of what Ada Hartman had worked out with a pencil, and Della was teaching the moves to anyone who asked, and Cole had taken over the daily logging and was thinking quietly about whether the journals should be typed up before the pencil faded, so that the next dry era would have them. Royce Maurer became of all things her friend. He came out a dozen times over those 2 years, and he stopped consulting people to sell down in droughts and started telling them to come look at the Hartman fence line and the thing he had to swallow to do that. The professional pride a credentialed man has to set down to say I was wrong and a woman with a dead grandmother's notebook was right. Quote, "What is the measure of the man?" And he set it down. He was never a villain. He was a good man who had mistaken his map for the country, and the drought, which is no respecter of degrees, had shown him the difference, and he had the character to look. Let me tell you the thing this story is actually about, because it is not really about grass, though every word of the grass is true. There are 2 kinds of knowing. There is the wide, fast, confident kind that can be taught in a classroom and printed on a tablet and applied to any ranch in any county. The kind that knows grass in general and is right about grass in general and was right, even about what 190 cows would do to 750 acres if you grazed them the way everyone grazed them. And there is the narrow, slow, patient kind that knows one piece of ground across 43 years, that knows the south slope holds 3 days longer, and the blue grandma comes back if you let it rest and the litter keeps the water from cooking off in August, the kind that cannot be scaled or generalized and is worth more, dawned on that one ranch, in that one drought, than all the general knowing in the world. The first kind measures what is easy to measure and calls the rest sentiment. The second kind watches what is hard to measure for 43 years and writes it down in pencil. Royce had the first, Ada had the second. And when the dry era came and settled the question the way only a structural thing can settle it, impersonally, fairly, without regard for anyone's degree or anyone's grief. It was the second kind of knowing left standing in the green, and the first kind standing at the fence asking how. Della Hartman is still on that ground. She runs the original 750 and the Brunner 320, and Dell runs cattle on shares the way they agreed, and Cole has a real notebook going now, and the old 11 are in a fireproof box, and the single-wide finally got replaced in 2025 with a small house Tom always meant to build. The dog is older. Trip rides in the truck still, gray on the muzzle now, and lies in the shade while the bunch grazes its little rectangle, and gets up when Della gets up, because the moves never stop, because the grass is always either resting or being grazed, and there is no such thing as a day off from watching it. People ask Della sometimes, the visitors who come to see the fence line, how she knew to ignore the experts when she was 28 and alone and frightened, and everyone she trusted told her to sell. And she always says the same thing, and it is the truest sentence in this whole account, and it belongs to a woman who never said it to her face. She didn't ignore the experts, she tells them. She just listened to an older one. And then she rolls up the wire and shuts the gate on the ground that gets to rest now, and walks to the next one, the dog at her heel, the way the grass taught her, the way the journals taught her, the way the dead teach the living when the living are quiet enough to read what they wrote down. Rest is the only thing that's free. Ada wrote it 11 times, and she was right 11 times, and the drought that broke the men who measured everything could not break the woman who had learned to wait.